The doors did not open with a soft chime like ordinary places. They parted in silence, thick glass sliding aside as if even sound itself was not welcome here. The air inside was warmer, heavier, carrying the faint scent of polished wood, expensive leather, and something colder beneath it, power, quiet and suffocating. Maddie stepped in slowly, one hand resting just beneath her ribs where the weight of 8 months pressed forward, undeniable and constant, a reminder she could neither hide from herself nor fully protect from the world she had once belonged to. Her coat hung loose, carefully chosen, dark and structured enough to disguise the curve of her body at a glance, but nothing could truly conceal what she carried. Not here. Not in a place built for legacy, for bloodlines, for futures decided long before a child ever took its first breath. This boutique was not for ordinary mothers. It was for heirs, for dynasties, for names that carried weight in whispers and fear in silence. She hadn't planned to come back. For months she had stayed away from everything tied to that world, its rules, its watchful eyes, its quiet violence dressed in elegance. She had told herself she didn't need any of it, that she could build something smaller, safer, hidden. But there were things she couldn't ignore anymore, things a child would need, and in her world even the smallest need came wrapped in risk. Her fingers tightened slightly against her coat as she moved deeper inside, her steps measured, controlled. She did not rush. She did not look around too quickly. The greatest mistake anyone could make here was appearing uncertain. Weakness wasn't pitied. It was noted, remembered, used. Once she had walked through places like this without thinking. Once she had belonged. That version of her felt like someone else now, someone softer, someone who believed promises meant something, that loyalty was not just another currency to be traded when it lost its value. She had learned differently, painfully, completely. Now she moved like someone who understood the cost of being seen. A woman behind the counter glanced up briefly, her expression polite but distant, trained not to ask questions unless necessary. That was the rule in places like this. You did not ask who the child belonged to. You did not ask where the mother came from. You simply observed, cataloged, and reported when it mattered. And it always mattered. Maddie felt it immediately, that subtle shift in the air, the quiet awareness that followed her presence. Not loud, not obvious, but there. Someone had noticed. Someone always noticed. Her heart beat slower, not faster. She had trained herself for that too. Panic drew attention. Stillness kept you alive. She moved toward a display of finely crafted cribs, each one more like a throne than a place for sleep. Carved wood, reinforced frames, hidden compartments, everything designed not just for comfort, but for protection. Because in this world, even a newborn could be a target if their bloodline carried enough weight. Her hand hovered briefly over one of them, fingers brushing the smooth edge. This wasn't just a child. This was a secret that could shift power. And that was exactly why she had stayed silent. The underworld didn't forgive surprises. It didn't tolerate unknown heirs appearing out of nowhere. Bloodlines were documented, controlled, protected, or eliminated. If they knew, if anyone traced this child back to its truth, it wouldn't just be her life at risk. It would be everything. Her throat tightened slightly, but her face remained calm, unreadable. She had learned how to carry fear without letting it show. It lived beneath the surface now, buried under layers of control and quiet resilience. She adjusted her coat again, subtly, instinctively shielding the curve of her stomach as if the fabric alone could protect what was inside. She wasn't here because she wanted to be. She was here because she had no other choice. Alone, not because she was abandoned, but because she had chosen it. Because trusting the wrong person in her world didn't just break your heart, it destroyed your future. And she could not afford that anymore. Not now. Not with a child whose existence was more dangerous than any enemy. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to breathe, slow and steady, her palm resting gently against her belly beneath the coat. "I've got you," she whispered silently, not daring to let the words reach her lips. Because in a place like this, even promises could be overheard. And secrets like hers didn't stay hidden for long. The first sound was not loud, but it cut through the silence with surgical precision. A low, familiar chuckle that did not belong to this moment yet claimed it instantly, as if the room itself had been waiting for it. Maddie's fingers froze against the polished edge of the crib, her breath catching somewhere between her chest and throat, not from fear alone, but from recognition so sharp it felt like memory had reached out and wrapped cold fingers around her spine. She did not turn immediately. She did not need to. That voice had once lived inside her mornings, her nights, her quietest thoughts, and now it moved through the boutique like something resurrected, something unfinished. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her head, her pulse steady but heavy, and allowed her gaze to shift toward the far end of the showroom where the light seemed to bend around him as if power itself followed his silhouette. Brandon Morty stood there, unchanged in all the ways that mattered, dressed in tailored black that fit him like authority, his posture relaxed but controlled, the kind of control that came from knowing no one in the room could challenge him without consequence. But it wasn't him alone that made the air tight. It was the woman at his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her presence calculated, precise, like a blade hidden beneath silk. Savannah Vyerly did not just enter a room. She positioned herself within it, every detail of her appearance curated to project elegance and dominance, from the flawless fall of her coat to the subtle gleam of diamonds that whispered old money and deeper alliances. Maddie felt it then, not as panic but as pressure, the kind that pressed inward from all sides, reminding her exactly where she was and who now stood within reach of the truth she had buried. She should leave. Every instinct sharpened toward that single decision. Walk away. Disappear before his eyes landed on her, before the past had the chance to collide with the future she was fighting to protect. Her hand tightened slightly against her coat, instinctively shielding the curve beneath it, but fate had never been kind enough to allow her quiet exits. Savannah's gaze moved first, scanning the room with practiced ease until it paused, sharpened, and locked onto Maddie with a flicker of recognition that turned almost instantly into something far more dangerous. There was no hesitation in her reaction, no doubt, only a slow, deliberate smile that spread across her lips as if she had just uncovered something valuable. "Well," she said softly, her voice smooth but edged with something unmistakably predatory, "this is unexpected." The words were not loud, but they carried, slipping through the quiet space and drawing subtle attention from the few others present, because names like theirs were never spoken in places like this without consequence. Brandon turned at the sound, his expression neutral at first, but the moment his eyes found Maddie, something shifted, not confusion, not surprise alone, but calculation, immediate and cold, as his gaze dropped, drawn inexorably to the place she had tried so hard to conceal. Time did not stop, but it slowed, stretching thin as realization began to form in his eyes, sharp and disbelieving, like a man staring at something that should not exist. Maddie held his gaze without flinching, even as the weight of that moment pressed harder against her ribs than the child she carried, because this was the collision she had feared, the one she had prepared for in silence, in isolation, in every sleepless night where she had told herself she could outrun this. She had been wrong. Brandon took a single step forward, not rushed, not aggressive but deliberate, like a man approaching a problem he intended to solve, and when he spoke her name it was quieter than expected, almost controlled, but beneath it lay something far more dangerous than anger. "Maddie." It wasn't a greeting. It was a claim, unfinished, unresolved, and suddenly the boutique no longer felt like a place of quiet transactions, but a stage where power, truth, and betrayal were about to collide. And somewhere deep beneath the calm mask she wore, Maddie understood with absolute clarity that the secret she had carried into this room was no longer safe. Savannah did not rush forward, nor did she raise her voice, because women like her never needed to chase a moment. They shaped it, bent it, controlled the rhythm until everyone else followed without realizing it. She stepped closer with measured elegance, her heels barely making a sound against the polished floor. Yet each movement felt deliberate, like a signal sent to every watchful eye in the boutique that something worth observing was unfolding. Her gaze did not leave Maddie, not for a second, and there was no warmth in it, no curiosity, only a sharp, glittering assessment, as if she were evaluating a flaw in an otherwise perfect display. "I didn't recognize you at first," she said softly, though her tone carried enough weight to draw attention from across the room, subtle conversations dimming into silence as those who understood power turned their focus toward the scene. "You look different." The pause was intentional, the kind that invited imagination to fill in the cruelty she chose not to speak outright. Maddie felt it, the shift in the air, the quiet gathering of unseen witnesses, because this was not just a conversation anymore. This was a performance, and Savannah had already decided the role she wanted Maddie to play. Brandon said nothing at first, his eyes fixed on Maddie with a focus that felt less like recognition and more like calculation, as if he were trying to piece together something that didn't align with the version of reality he had constructed for himself. His gaze dropped again, slower this time, deliberate, tracing the unmistakable curve beneath her coat despite every effort she had made to conceal it. The silence stretched just long enough to become suffocating before Savannah tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into a faint smile that did not reach her eyes. 8 months, she asked, her voice laced with something dangerously close to amusement. Or are you closer than that? The question was invasive, intimate in the most violating way, and it landed exactly as intended, not just on Maddie, but on the room itself, because now there was no pretending this was anything less than a public unveiling. A murmur rippled through the boutique, quiet but unmistakable, the kind of reaction that traveled through the underworld like smoke, carrying implications far heavier than words. Maddie's fingers tightened against the fabric of her coat, but her expression did not break. She had learned that much, at least. She had learned how to stand still while being dissected, how to let the storm pass over her without revealing where it hurt most. "It's none of your concern," she said, her voice steady, controlled, but Savannah only smiled wider, as if Maddie had just confirmed exactly what she wanted. "Everything in this world becomes someone's concern eventually," she replied smoothly, her eyes flicking briefly toward the surrounding displays, the carefully curated environment that existed for one purpose only, the continuation of bloodlines that mattered. Brandon exhaled sharply, a sound that carried more tension than he likely intended, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its earlier control, replaced by something edged and restless. "You didn't tell anyone," he said, not as a question, but as an accusation, his gaze locking onto hers with intensity that bordered on possessive. "You disappear for months and then show up like this." The word lingered, unfinished, but heavy enough to suggest everything he refused to say directly. Maddie felt the weight of it press against her chest, not because she doubted herself, but because she recognized the pattern, the way he twisted silence into guilt, absence into wrongdoing. It used to break her. It didn't anymore. Savannah stepped closer still, close enough now that the faint scent of her perfume cut through the air between them, sharp and expensive, impossible to ignore. "You know how this looks, don't you?" she murmured, her voice dipping just enough to feel intimate while still carrying far enough for others to hear. "A hidden pregnancy, no announcement, no name attached in our world, that's not just unusual." Her eyes gleamed, satisfaction flickering beneath the surface. "That's dangerous." The words settled into the room like a verdict, and for the first time, the tension shifted from curiosity to something darker, something sharper, because now the question was no longer just who the father was, but what this child represented. Brandon's jaw tightened, his expression hardening as he took another step forward, closing the distance between them as if proximity alone would force the truth out of her. "Who is it?" he demanded quietly, the softness of his tone making it more threatening than any shout. "Who did you move on with?" The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating, and for a brief moment the world seemed to narrow, the weight of every eye, every expectation, pressing in on Maddie from all sides. But instead of shrinking, instead of breaking the way she once would have, she lifted her chin slightly, meeting his gaze with a calm that was far more dangerous than anger. "I didn't move on," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "I moved away." The words landed harder than anything raised in volume, because they carried truth, and truth in a place like this was more destabilizing than any lie. Savannah's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, just long enough to reveal the crack beneath her composure, while Brandon's expression darkened, something unsettled flickering behind his eyes as if the control he thought he still had was beginning to slip. And in that fragile shift, that barely visible fracture in their confidence, Maddie realized something important. This wasn't just about humiliation anymore. This was about power, about perception, about a secret that was no longer hidden but not yet understood. And as the silence thickened once more, she knew with absolute certainty that the moment they uncovered the truth behind the child she carried, nothing in this room would remain the same. The silence that followed Maddie's words did not feel empty. It felt charged, like the moment before a storm splits the sky open. Brandon's expression hardened, his control slipping in subtle, dangerous ways, the kind that only those who knew him intimately would recognize. His shoulders squared, his gaze sharpened, and the space between them seemed to shrink as if the air itself was being pulled into his orbit. Savannah, sensing the shift, tilted her head slightly, her lips curving again, but this time there was impatience beneath the elegance, as though the performance was no longer unfolding the way she had scripted it. "Moved away," she echoed softly, her voice laced with disbelief that bordered on mockery. "From what exactly? Responsibility, or just the consequences of your choices?" The words were precise, crafted not just to wound Maddie, but to frame her in a way the room would accept, to turn silence into suspicion, and suspicion into judgment. It was a calculated move, one designed to strip Maddie of dignity in the very place where reputation meant survival. Brandon stepped closer, close enough now that the faint scent of his cologne, familiar, unwelcome, cut through her senses like a ghost of a life she had buried. "You don't get to rewrite what happened," he said quietly, but the tension beneath his voice made it clear this was no longer about curiosity. This was about control. "You walked away without a word, without an explanation, and now you expect me to just accept this." His eyes flicked again to her stomach, lingering there, as if the sight itself challenged everything he believed about the past. Maddie felt the weight of his stare, but she did not move, did not retreat. She had spent too long learning how to stand still in the face of him. She would not give that up now. Before she could respond, before the tension could snap into something louder, something more dangerous, a presence entered the space behind her so quietly it was almost imperceptible, yet its effect was immediate, undeniable. It was not the sound of footsteps that marked his arrival, but the shift in the room itself, the subtle way conversation stilled, the way attention redirected without command. Power did not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply existed, and everything else adjusted accordingly. A voice came from just behind Maddie's shoulder, low, calm, and controlled in a way that carried more authority than any raised tone ever could. "That's enough." The words were simple, almost understated, but they landed with weight, cutting cleanly through the tension like a blade through silk. Maddie felt it before she saw him, the steadiness, the grounded presence that seemed to anchor the space around her, and when she turned slightly, her breath caught, not in shock, but in recognition of something far more dangerous than familiarity. Colton Hale did not step into the center of the confrontation. He positioned himself beside her, close enough to be unmistakably aligned, far enough to maintain control of the moment. His posture was relaxed, but there was nothing casual about him. His gaze moved once briefly from Maddie to Brandon, and in that single glance, the balance of power in the room shifted. Brandon's reaction was immediate, though he tried to mask it. His jaw tightened, his shoulders stiffening ever so slightly, a flicker of something, irritation perhaps, or something closer to unease, passing through his expression before it settled back into forced composure. "And you are?" he asked, his tone edged with challenge but lacking the certainty it once carried so easily. Colton did not answer right away. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was deliberate, controlled, and in that pause the unspoken recognition settled into the room. People knew him. Maybe not all, but enough. Enough for the air to feel different. Savannah's eyes narrowed, her attention shifting fully now, reassessing, recalculating, her earlier confidence thinning just slightly at the edges. "I don't recall inviting an audience," she said coolly, though her voice lacked the effortless dominance it held moments ago. Colton's gaze moved to her then, steady and unreadable, and when he spoke it was with the same quiet certainty that made resistance feel almost irrelevant. "You didn't," he replied. "But you also didn't earn the right to continue this." There was no aggression in his tone, no need for it, because the authority behind his words made them final in a way that did not require repetition. Maddie felt something shift inside her then, something subtle but undeniable, like the first crack of light breaking through a long, suffocating darkness. She had stood alone in this moment, braced for impact, prepared to endure whatever came next, but now there was something else beside her, not overwhelming, not controlling, just present. Steady. And for the first time since stepping into the boutique, the weight pressing against her chest eased, if only slightly. Brandon exhaled sharply, a humorless sound, his eyes flicking between Maddie and Colton as if trying to piece together something he did not fully understand. "You're inserting yourself into something that has nothing to do with you," he said, but the words lacked conviction. Colton's expression didn't change. "It has everything to do with me," he said calmly, and then, without raising his voice, without stepping forward or making any grand display, he added, "Because she does." The words were simple, but they landed with a force that rippled through the room, silencing whatever remained of Savannah's performance and cracking the fragile control Brandon had tried to maintain. And in that moment, standing between the past that had broken her and the presence that now shielded her, Maddie realized something she had not allowed herself to believe before. This confrontation was no longer happening to her. It was shifting around her. And for the first time, she was not the weakest one in the room. The shift in power did not settle quietly. It rippled outward, subtle but unmistakable, like a tremor beneath polished marble that only those attuned to danger could feel. Savannah's smile did not vanish, but it changed, tightening at the edges as her gaze moved between Colton and Maddie with a sharper, more calculating focus, as if she were rearranging the pieces of a game she had assumed she was already winning. Brandon, on the other hand, did not hide his reaction as well. The brief hesitation in his posture, the slight narrowing of his eyes, betrayed something deeper than irritation. It was recognition, the kind that came with understanding exactly who had just stepped into his space, and what that meant for the control he had been so certain of only moments before. But Brandon Morty had never been a man who stepped back easily, not from a challenge, not from a threat, and certainly not from something that threatened his pride. He let out a slow breath, forcing composure back into place as his gaze returned to Maddie, sharper now, more focused, as if Colton's presence had only intensified the need to assert dominance over what he still, somewhere deep inside, believed belonged to him. "So this is it," he said, his voice quieter now but edged with something far more dangerous than volume. "You disappear, you come back like this, and suddenly you've got someone stepping in to speak for you." The implication was deliberate, poisonous in its subtlety, and it hung in the air long enough for the surrounding silence to absorb it fully. Savannah seized it instantly, stepping forward just enough to reclaim attention, her expression softening into something almost sympathetic, though the glint in her eyes betrayed the performance. "It does make things clearer," she added smoothly, her gaze sliding over Maddie's concealed form with renewed interest. "You're not alone after all. That explains a lot." Maddie felt the words press against her, not because they struck truth, but because of how they would be interpreted in a world where perception dictated survival. A woman appearing with a hidden pregnancy and a powerful man at her side was not seen as protected. It was seen as claimed, owned, and that narrative could become far more dangerous than any accusation Brandon had made so far. Her fingers tightened instinctively against the fabric of her coat, her body reacting before her mind fully caught up, but she forced herself to remain still, to breathe through the tension that threatened to rise. She would not let them define this moment. She had spent too long being shaped by someone else's version of her. Brandon's eyes darkened as he watched her, something restless flickering beneath the surface, something that no longer felt like curiosity alone. "You still haven't answered me," he said, his tone tightening, each word more deliberate than the last. "Who is the father?" The question landed heavier this time, not because it was louder, but because it carried intent, sharpened by the presence of an audience that would remember every detail of what unfolded here. Savannah tilted her head slightly, her lips curving once more as if savoring the moment. "Yes," she murmured, her voice smooth as silk but edged like a blade. "I think we all deserve to know. In our world, bloodlines aren't exactly optional information." The room seemed to close in, the quiet no longer passive but watchful, waiting. Maddie could feel it, the collective attention pressing against her, the unspoken demand for an answer that would either secure her place or strip it away entirely. But the truth was not something she could offer, not here, not like this. Because the truth was not just complicated. It was dangerous. It was a secret that did not belong to this room, to these people, to this moment of calculated cruelty. It was something far larger, far more volatile than any of them understood. Before she could speak, before she could choose silence or defiance, Savannah took another step closer, her voice lowering just enough to feel intimate while still carrying through the charged air. "Or is that why you've been so quiet?" she added, her eyes gleaming with something unmistakably malicious. "Because you don't know." The words struck like a match dropped into dry tinder, igniting a reaction that rippled instantly through the space, murmurs rising, subtle but sharp, curiosity turning into something darker, something more judgmental. It was the kind of insinuation that didn't need proof to become truth in the eyes of those who wanted something to believe. Colton's posture shifted beside Maddie, not aggressively, not dramatically, but enough to signal that the line had been crossed. His gaze moved to Savannah, steady and cold, the kind of look that did not need words to carry warning. "Careful," he said quietly, his voice calm but edged with steel. "You're stepping into territory you don't understand." Savannah's smile flickered just for a moment, but she didn't step back. "Oh, I understand perfectly," she replied, though there was a slight tension in her voice now, a crack in the flawless control she had maintained. "I just think secrets like this don't stay hidden forever." Brandon's jaw tightened, his gaze snapping back to Maddie as if Savannah's words had triggered something deeper, something more urgent. "If you think you can just show up like this and expect no one to question it, you're wrong," he said, his voice dropping lower, more intense. "You owe an explanation." The words echoed something old, something familiar, the same demand for control disguised as concern, and for a split second the past threatened to pull her under. But then she felt it again, that steady presence beside her, not overwhelming, not controlling, just there, unwavering, and it anchored her in a way nothing else could. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the noise with a clarity that made even the murmurs falter. "I don't owe you anything." The words landed cleanly, without hesitation, without apology, and for a brief moment everything stilled. Brandon stared at her, something raw flickering across his face, something that looked almost like disbelief, as if he were seeing a version of her he did not recognize, could not control. Savannah's expression tightened, her confidence slipping just enough to reveal the irritation beneath. And beside Maddie, Colton did not move, did not speak, but the silence he held felt stronger than anything said aloud, because in that moment it became clear that whatever truth they were trying to drag into the light, it would not be given freely. And that made it far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. The tension did not break, it sharpened, tightening like a wire pulled too far, humming with the kind of pressure that promised something would snap. Brandon's eyes locked onto Maddie with an intensity that had nothing to do with concern anymore and everything to do with control slipping through his fingers. He was not used to being denied, not by her, not by anyone, and the quiet certainty in her refusal unsettled him more than any argument could have. For a moment, it seemed like he might push further, escalate the confrontation into something louder, something messier. But then something shifted, subtle and dangerous, as if another thought had slipped into place behind his eyes. His gaze flickered away from her face, not retreating, but recalculating, scanning the space around them with a precision that suggested he was no longer just reacting, he was remembering. Savannah noticed it too. The slight change in his posture, the way his jaw tightened, the way his attention drifted not outward, but inward, as if something he had been certain of was beginning to fracture. Her fingers curled lightly around his arm, not in affection, but in control, a silent reminder of the position she had worked so carefully to secure. "What is it?" she asked softly, her voice still smooth but no longer effortless, the edge of suspicion creeping in despite her composure. Brandon didn't answer immediately. His focus returned to Maddie, slower this time, heavier, his eyes dropping once more to the curve beneath her coat. But now there was something else behind his stare, something sharper than doubt, something closer to recognition colliding with contradiction. "We came here for a reason," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the charged silence with a firmness that felt almost defensive, as though he were trying to ground himself in something tangible. Savannah blinked, thrown off balance for the first time, her brows drawing together slightly. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her tone tightening despite her attempt to keep it light. Brandon exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that betrayed more agitation than he likely intended. "The air preparations," he said, too quickly, the words slipping out before he could filter them, before he could reshape them into something less revealing. The effect was immediate. Savannah's grip on his arm tightened, not gently this time, but with a sharp, almost painful pressure that pulled his attention fully back to her. "The what?" she demanded, her voice dropping, no longer performing for the room but cutting straight through the illusion she had been maintaining. The boutique, once a stage for Maddie's humiliation, shifted again, the focus turning inward, the audience now watching something far more unpredictable unfold between them. Brandon froze just for a second, but it was enough. Enough for Savannah to see the crack, enough for everyone to feel it. "You said we were browsing," she continued, her voice lower now, controlled but trembling at the edges, as if each word had to fight its way past the realization forming in her mind. "You said it wasn't serious yet." The tension between them tightened, no longer aligned, no longer united, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Savannah looked uncertain. Not weak, not defeated, but unsettled, as if the narrative she had so carefully constructed was beginning to slip out of her control. Brandon's gaze flickered between her and Maddie, something raw and unsteady surfacing beneath the surface of his composure. "Savannah, not here," he muttered, his voice strained, but the damage had already been done. Because now the implication was clear not just to her but to anyone who understood the weight of those words. Air preparations were not casual. They were not theoretical. They were tied to legacy, to bloodlines, to decisions that shaped power for generations. And suddenly, the room was no longer asking who Maddie's child belonged to. It was asking why Brandon had come here at all. Colton's presence beside Maddie remained unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in his stance, a quiet awareness sharpening his focus as he observed the unraveling dynamic with the patience of someone who did not need to intervene to control the outcome. His gaze moved briefly to Maddie, not questioning, not demanding, simply acknowledging the moment for what it was, a fracture widening in real time. Savannah stepped back slightly, her hand falling from Brandon's arm as if the contact itself had become uncertain. "You lied to me," she said, her voice no longer smooth, no longer calculated, but edged with something real, something volatile. Brandon's jaw clenched, his control slipping further with each passing second. "I didn't lie," he snapped, though the force of his denial only made it sound less convincing. "I just didn't explain everything." "That's the same thing," Savannah shot back, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the anger beneath, the betrayal she had not anticipated feeling. Because this was not part of her plan. This was not a move she had prepared for. Maddie stood still, watching it unfold, the tension shifting away from her, the pressure easing just enough for her to breathe more freely. But beneath that relief, something else stirred, something colder, sharper. Because Brandon's mistake, his slip, had revealed more than just deception. It had exposed intent. And intent in their world was never accidental. Colton's voice broke the tension again, quiet but unmistakably firm. "Looks like you have bigger problems than her," he said, his tone calm, almost conversational, but the meaning beneath it was clear. This was no longer about Maddie. This was about something Brandon had tried and failed to keep hidden. And whatever it was starting to surface whether he was ready for it or not. The fracture between them did not stay contained. It spread, invisible but undeniable, threading through the room like a fault line that threatened to split everything apart. Savannah's composure, once flawless, now carried sharp edges, her gaze no longer fixed on Maddie but locked onto Brandon with a kind of intensity that stripped away all performance. Whatever control she had believed she possessed was slipping, and she knew it. Brandon, for his part, looked caught between two collapsing fronts, his authority eroding in ways he could not immediately repair, his attention torn between the woman he stood beside and the one he could no longer ignore. And in the center of it all stood Maddie, still, silent, her body suddenly feeling heavier, not just from the child she carried, but from the pressure building around her, tightening with every passing second. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, a tightening low in her abdomen that she might have ignored in any other moment. But stress had a way of amplifying everything, turning small warnings into undeniable signals. She shifted slightly, her hand instinctively pressing against her side beneath the coat, her breath catching just enough to betray the change to someone watching closely. Colton noticed immediately. He didn't need words, didn't need confirmation. His focus sharpened, his attention narrowing entirely onto her as the chaos around them faded into background noise. "Maddie," he said quietly, his voice grounding, steady, cutting through the rising tension like a tether. "Look at me." She tried, but the sensation deepened, a second wave following the first, stronger, more insistent, not quite pain, but something dangerously close to it. Savannah's voice cut through the moment, sharper now, stripped of its earlier sweetness. "What's wrong with her?" she demanded, though the question carried more irritation than concern, as if Maddie's reaction was an inconvenience to the unraveling confrontation she had not yet regained control of. Brandon turned fully then, his attention snapping back to Maddie with a flicker of something that resembled concern, though it was tangled with confusion, frustration, and something darker beneath. "Are you okay?" he asked, stepping forward instinctively, but the movement was immediate, blocked, not aggressively, not forcefully, but with absolute certainty. Colton shifted just enough to place himself between them, his presence solid, immovable, a barrier that did not need to raise its voice to be understood. "She needs space," Colton said, his tone calm but final, leaving no room for argument. Brandon's expression darkened, his instincts pushing against the boundary even as the authority behind it forced him to hesitate. "I wasn't talking to you," he snapped, but the edge in his voice carried less confidence than before, less control. "You don't get to decide that." Colton didn't move, didn't react to the challenge in the way Brandon expected. He simply held his ground, his gaze steady, his presence unshaken. "I already did," he replied, and the quiet certainty in his voice made it clear that this was not a negotiation. Maddie's breath came slower now, more deliberate, as she fought to steady herself, her fingers gripping the edge of a nearby display just enough to anchor her. The room seemed brighter, sharper, the edges of everything slightly blurred as her body tried to process both the physical strain and the emotional storm crashing over her. This was not how it was supposed to happen. Not here, not like this. She had planned for distance, for silence, for control. Instead, everything was unraveling at once, pulling her into the very center of the world she had tried so hard to escape. A third wave hit, stronger than the last, forcing a quiet gasp from her lips before she could stop it. That was enough. The shift in Colton was immediate, subtle but unmistakable, his entire focus locking onto her with a precision that spoke of experience, of control under pressure. "We're not staying here," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of authority that didn't wait for agreement. His hand hovered near her arm, not touching without permission but close enough to steady her if needed. "You need to sit down." "I'm fine," she managed, though the words felt thinner than she intended, her body betraying the strength she tried to project. Brandon took another step forward, frustration bleeding through his expression. "She doesn't look fine," he said, his voice tightening. "If something's wrong, then you've already made it worse," Colton cut in, not raising his voice but sharpening it just enough to silence him. The words landed harder than any accusation because they carried truth Brandon could not easily deny. Savannah, for once, said nothing. She watched, her expression unreadable now, her earlier confidence replaced with something colder, more observant, as if she were recalculating everything she thought she understood about the situation. Because this was no longer a simple confrontation. This was something else, something deeper. Maddie forced herself to straighten slightly, her breathing steadier now, though the tension had not fully eased. She could feel it lingering beneath the surface, a warning rather than a crisis, but enough to remind her that she was not alone in her body anymore. Every decision, every moment of stress, carried weight beyond herself. Colton's gaze softened just slightly as he looked at her, not with pity, not with urgency, but with quiet certainty. "You don't have to stand through this," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Not anymore." The words settled into her, grounding her in a way that the chaos around them could not disrupt, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of stepping away, not as retreat but as choice. Behind them, Brandon stood frozen, his control fractured, his authority slipping through cracks he could not close fast enough. And somewhere deeper in the room, beneath the polished surfaces and quiet watchers, something else had begun to shift, something far more dangerous than a public argument or a bruised ego. Because the moment Maddie faltered, even slightly, the stakes changed. This was no longer just about reputation. It was about the air she carried. And in a world built on blood and power, that changed everything. The moment stretched thin, fragile as glass, and then it cracked. Not with a shout, not with violence, but with something far more dangerous, a truth forced too close to the surface to stay buried any longer. Brandon's composure, already fractured, gave way in subtle, irreversible ways, his gaze no longer sharp with accusation but clouded with something heavier, something tangled between fear and inevitability. He looked at Maddie differently now, not as a problem to control, but as a reality he could no longer ignore or reshape. The shift was small, almost imperceptible, but in a room built on reading power, it was enough to change everything. Savannah sensed it instantly. Her posture stiffened, her attention snapping back to him with a precision that cut through whatever remained of her earlier performance. "What aren't you saying?" she asked, her voice lower now, stripped of its previous polish, edged with something far more real. There was no audience in her tone anymore, no calculation, only demand. Brandon exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair again, the gesture no longer controlled, no longer measured. It was restless, unsteady. "This isn't the place," he muttered, but even as he said it, his eyes flicked back to Maddie, drawn by something he could not ignore, something that had begun to unravel the certainty he once held so tightly. Colton didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. He watched, silent, steady, his presence a quiet pressure that forced truth forward simply by refusing to allow it to retreat. Maddie felt it too, that subtle shift in the air, the sense that whatever came next was no longer avoidable. The secret she had carried, the silence she had protected, was being pulled into the light, not by her choice, but by the cracks forming in the man who had once controlled her life. Savannah stepped closer to Brandon, her voice tightening despite her effort to remain composed. "You're reacting like you know something," she said, her eyes narrowing as she searched his face. "Something you haven't told me." The accusation landed hard, but it wasn't just directed at him anymore. It hovered between all of them, a question that demanded an answer whether anyone was ready to give it or not. Brandon swallowed, his jaw tightening, his gaze dropping once more to Maddie's stomach, but this time it wasn't just suspicion in his eyes, it was conflict. "I didn't think," he began, then stopped, the words catching somewhere between intention and fear. "I didn't think this was possible." The sentence hung there, incomplete but heavy enough to draw every eye in the room closer, tighter, sharper. Maddie felt the weight of it settle into her chest, not as shock, but as recognition, because she knew exactly what he meant. She had always known this moment would come, that eventually the truth would press too hard against the walls he had built around himself. But knowing it and standing in it were two very different things. Savannah's expression sharpened, her patience fracturing. "What does that mean?" she demanded, her voice rising slightly, no longer concerned with appearances. "What isn't possible?" Brandon closed his eyes for a brief second, as if trying to steady himself, but when he opened them again, there was no control left to hide behind. Only truth, raw and unfiltered. "I can't have children," he said. The words landed like a detonation. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise, thick and suffocating, pressing in from all sides as the meaning of his confession settled into place. Savannah stared at him, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, her lips parting slightly as if the world had just tilted beneath her feet. "What?" she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying everything it needed to. Brandon's gaze didn't leave Maddie now, as if he were searching her face for something, anything that would confirm or deny what his own words had just implied. "I found out before I left," he continued, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier sharpness. "The tests, they weren't inconclusive, they were final." His jaw clenched, the admission costing him more than he wanted to show. "I thought it was better to walk away than to stay and let you realize it was my fault." His eyes flickered with something that looked almost like regret, but it was too late for that to matter. Maddie's breath caught, not from surprise, but from the weight of the truth finally spoken aloud, the validation she had never received until now. For months, she had carried not just the child but the quiet echo of his accusations, the doubt he had planted so deeply she had questioned herself even in her silence. And now, standing in front of him, hearing it laid bare, she felt something shift inside her, something heavy lifting, even as the situation grew more dangerous. Savannah stepped back, her composure shattering completely now, her voice trembling with anger and realization. "So you let her believe she was the problem," she said, her gaze cutting into him with a sharpness that rivaled her earlier cruelty. "You built everything on a lie just to protect yourself." Brandon flinched, the accusation striking deeper than anything Maddie had said. Colton's voice broke through the silence, calm but firm, carrying a weight that grounded the moment. "And now you're standing here accusing her of something that was never hers to carry," he said, his gaze steady on Brandon. "That's not just a mistake, that's a choice." The words settled into the room like a final verdict, and for the first time since this confrontation began, Brandon had nothing left to counter with. Because the truth had been spoken. And it had changed everything. Now the question was no longer who Maddie's child belonged to. It was something far more dangerous. If Brandon could not be the father, then who could? The truth did not settle into the room gently. It spread like fire beneath the surface, silent but consuming everything it touched. Brandon's confession still hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, stripping away the illusion he had built around himself for years, but it was not the end of the unraveling. It was only the beginning. Savannah stood frozen for a moment, her breathing shallow, her mind racing visibly behind her eyes as she recalculated everything she thought she knew, every move she had made, every truth she had twisted. Then something shifted in her expression, not confusion, not shock, but recognition, the kind that comes when a puzzle suddenly completes itself in the worst possible way. Her gaze snapped toward Maddie, sharper now, almost searching, as if looking for confirmation of something she had not intended to reveal. "So that's why," she murmured, her voice lower, quieter, but far more dangerous than before. Brandon turned toward her, tension snapping back into his posture. "Why what?" he demanded, but Savannah barely acknowledged him. She was no longer focused on him. She was focused on Maddie, on the secret that had just become far more significant than either of them had anticipated. "You didn't tell him," Savannah continued, her eyes narrowing slightly, her tone shifting into something colder, something edged with realization rather than mockery. "Not because you were ashamed, but because you knew it would destroy everything." The words landed differently this time, not as an insult but as an observation, and that made them far more dangerous, because now she was thinking, connecting, seeing beyond the surface. Maddie felt it instantly, the shift in Savannah's attention, the way her mind was moving, circling the truth like a predator closing in. Her fingers tightened against her coat again, not from fear alone, but from the sudden understanding that this was no longer just about exposure. This was about someone getting too close to the real answer. Brandon's frustration surged, his control fraying further as he stepped forward again. "Stop talking in circles," he snapped, his voice sharper now, demanding clarity he could no longer force into place. "What are you implying?" Savannah exhaled slowly, her composure returning in a different form, not smooth, not polished, but focused, deliberate. "I'm implying," she said carefully, her gaze never leaving Maddie, "that this isn't random." The words hung between them, quiet but explosive. "This child isn't a mistake, it's a decision." The air shifted again, heavier this time, more dangerous, because now the narrative had changed entirely. This was no longer about scandal. It was about intent. Colton's presence beside Maddie remained steady, but there was a subtle tightening in his stance, a quiet alertness that mirrored the shift in the room. He had been watching, listening, measuring every word, and now his focus sharpened, his gaze locking onto Savannah with a cold precision that did not go unnoticed. "Careful," he said quietly, his voice carrying a warning beneath its calm surface. "You're stepping into something you don't understand." Savannah's lips curved slightly, but there was no warmth in it, no arrogance, only certainty. "Oh, I understand more than you think," she replied, her voice softer now, but far more controlled than it had been since Brandon's confession. She took a slow step forward, her heels echoing faintly against the floor, her eyes flicking briefly to Colton before returning to Maddie. "You were always quieter than people realized," she continued, her tone almost reflective, as if piecing together a memory she had overlooked. "Everyone thought you were just compliant, easy to control." Her gaze hardened slightly. "But you were paying attention, watching, waiting." Maddie's breath slowed, not from calm but from focus, her mind aligning with the shift in the conversation, understanding that Savannah was no longer guessing blindly. She was remembering, and that made her dangerous. Brandon frowned, confusion deepening as he looked between them. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice losing its authority with each unanswered question. Savannah didn't look at him. "I'm talking about the fact that she knew," she said, her voice steady now, unwavering. "She knew you couldn't have children." The words landed hard, pulling Brandon's attention back to Maddie with a sharp, disbelieving focus. Maddie held his gaze, her silence speaking louder than any denial. Savannah's expression shifted again, something darker settling into place as the final pieces began to align. "And if she knew that," she continued slowly, "then she also knew exactly what this would do." Her eyes dropped briefly to Maddie's stomach, then lifted again, sharper than before. "Not just to you, but to everyone watching." The implications settled into the room like a shadow stretching across the floor. This wasn't just a hidden child. This was a move. Brandon shook his head slightly, as if trying to reject the idea forming in his mind. "No," he muttered, his voice quieter now, uncertain. "She would." But even as he said it, doubt crept in, eroding the certainty he once held about her, about everything. Colton's gaze didn't waver, but there was something else in it now, something deeper, something almost knowing. He had not interrupted Savannah, had not corrected her, and that silence spoke volumes. Savannah noticed. Her eyes flicked to him again, narrowing slightly as a new realization sparked behind them, sharper than the last. "Unless," she began, her voice trailing just enough to draw attention, to build tension, to let the thought settle before she finished it. Her gaze moved between them, slower this time, more deliberate. "Unless this isn't just her decision." The room stilled completely, because now the question had changed again. Not who the father was, not why Maddie had hidden the child, but who had been powerful enough to stand behind her in silence. And why? The silence that followed Savannah's realization did not feel like an ending. It felt like the moment before everything irreversible began. The air itself seemed to tighten, every breath heavier, every glance sharper, as if the room had become aware that something far more dangerous than a public confrontation was unfolding. Maddie stood still, her pulse steady despite the storm rising around her, because deep down, beneath the fear and the exhaustion and the weight of everything she had carried alone, there was something else now: clarity. The truth had been circling this moment from the very beginning, hidden beneath silence, protected by distance, but it had never truly been gone. And now it was here. Savannah's gaze locked onto Colton with a precision that stripped away every remaining layer of uncertainty. She wasn't guessing anymore. She was seeing. "It's you," she said quietly, the words not thrown, not dramatic, but placed with careful certainty, as if she had finally uncovered the last piece of a puzzle she hadn't realized she was solving. Brandon's head snapped toward Colton, his expression shifting instantly, disbelief clashing with something far darker. "That's not possible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, because somewhere beneath his denial, something had already begun to align. Colton did not react immediately. He didn't step forward, didn't raise his voice, didn't try to control the narrative the way Brandon always had. He simply stood there, calm, composed, his presence steady in a way that made everything else feel unbalanced. His gaze moved once briefly to Maddie, not questioning, not seeking permission, but acknowledging her, grounding her in a moment that had already gone too far to retreat from. Then he looked back at Savannah, and in that quiet, controlled shift, the answer became undeniable without needing to be spoken. Savannah exhaled slowly, her composure returning in a different form, colder now, sharper, her earlier irritation replaced by something far more dangerous: understanding. "Of course," she murmured, almost to herself, her lips curving faintly, though there was no amusement in it. "That's why you didn't panic. That's why you've been so calm this entire time." Her eyes flicked briefly to Maddie's stomach before returning to Colton. "You already knew." Brandon took a step back, his balance, physical and otherwise, shifting as the realization hit him fully, the weight of it too heavy to deny any longer. "You're telling me," he began, his voice tightening, his eyes moving between them as if searching for something to contradict what was becoming painfully clear. "You're telling me that child—" He couldn't finish the sentence, not because he didn't know the answer, but because saying it out loud would make it real in a way he couldn't undo. Maddie felt the moment settle around her, not as chaos, but as something quieter, something more controlled than she had expected. She had imagined this truth as explosive, as something that would tear everything apart in an instant, but instead, it unfolded with a slow, undeniable certainty that left no room for denial. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice steady when she finally spoke, not loud, not defensive, just clear. "He didn't find out today," she said, her gaze meeting Brandon's directly. "He's known." The words landed harder than anything else that had been said. Brandon's expression fractured completely, whatever control he had left dissolving under the weight of it. "You knew," he repeated, turning to Colton, his voice raw now, stripped of authority. "You knew this entire time." Colton didn't flinch. "Yes," he replied simply, and the lack of hesitation in his answer made it far more powerful than any explanation could have been. Savannah let out a quiet breath, her mind moving quickly, already calculating the implications, the shift in power, the consequences that would ripple far beyond this room. "Then this isn't just a child," she said softly, her gaze sharpening again as it moved between them. "This is a claim." The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning, because in their world blood was never just personal. It was political, strategic, dangerous. Colton's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in his stance, a quiet assertion that needed no elaboration. "It's not a claim," he said calmly. "It's a future." His eyes flicked briefly to Maddie, softer for a fraction of a second before returning to the others. "And it's not one either of you get to interfere with." The finality in his voice settled over the room like a closing door. Brandon stood frozen, the weight of everything crashing down at once. His past decisions, his lies, the truth he had avoided, and now the reality that what stood in front of him was no longer something he could control, fix, or reclaim. He had lost something he didn't even know he still had. Savannah, for once, said nothing. She simply watched, her mind already shifting toward survival, toward the next move, because even she understood when a game had been lost. Maddie exhaled slowly, the tension that had gripped her chest for months finally loosening, not completely, not yet, but enough for her to feel the difference. She was no longer standing alone in the shadows of a world that had broken her. She was standing at the edge of something new. Not escape. Not survival. Something stronger. And as she turned slightly, allowing Colton to guide her away from the room, away from the past that had finally collapsed under its own weight, she realized something she had not allowed herself to believe before. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of a legacy no one in that room had been prepared for.